Okay, I got two things I want to talk about today, so I'm going to try and squeeze them both in here. If I run out of time, though, I'll just make it this first one, which is on the topic generally of inflation, because this is something I've been a little more tight-lipped on it because I'm torn. I'm really torn on what's going on with the economy right now. I studied economics in depth, while I was in college, and by that I don't just mean that I majored in it. I mean that was kind of like my life for those 4 years. When I was not in class, that was my main interest. That was my main hobby, was reading economics and trying to understand history. Economic histories is something that is not really taught in colleges, but it's incredibly important to understand the future. You have to understand the past. And looking at past inflations and things, it's been really hard to understand what's been going on in the United States. Our monetary system is so complex and opaque that it is very difficult to accurately analyze it to any meaningful degree. Anyone who's listened to this channel for long enough understands that this is where I've come to. However, there are now calls, now that inflation has certainly picked up in the last few months, there are more and more calls from even mainstream folks. Today it was Bill Ackman giving a speech at the New York Fed, talking his book, saying that the Fed needs to hike rates and taper immediately. Now, while I agree with Bill Ackman's sentiment, obviously he was doing this, for his own gain, because he's saying, hey, this is how I positioned myself, but I positioned myself this way because it's what I think needs to happen. I can't really fault someone for talking their book and saying what they think the Fed needs to do, because, what do you expect him to do if he's a money manager and he thinks that the Fed should be raising rates in hopes that they do that? Do you think he should do the opposite so that he's positioned poorly for when that happens? When the Fed drives so much of what's going on in the market, you can't just expect people who manage money to not have an opinion on the Fed. Obviously, they would want the Fed to do what they're positioned for so that they make money. But if the Fed decides to do something else and they know that, they'll just position themselves differently. So I'm not just going to sit here and knock Bill Ackman for talking his book, because it's true that the Fed should hike rates. They should have hiked rates many, many years ago. The Fed should not target interest rates. Interest rates should be set by the supply and demand for loanable funds, like you're taught in Economics 101. The supply of money should not be elastic. Interest rates should be elastic. But with that said, considering that the Fed had interest rates at 0% going back all the way pretty much to 2008, it's hard for me to say that the Fed targeting a 0% interest rate is what is causing the inflation right now, because the Fed was doing that for the last 10 years. And you could say, well, there's all this government spending. That I certainly agree with. That's the one thing that I looked at. I looked at it last year. I thought it was going to be a problem. We have the government spending all this money that's being monetized by the Fed. Now, is that enough to really create all this inflation, or to create a lot of inflation? That I don't know, because you don't have it's hard to know the amount of money that's being created right now. How much money is that relative to all the money that's actually in circulation? Because we don't have an accurate metric for the money supply. Now, what I would argue is that the amount of money, and the amount of dollars, let me put this specifically, the amount of dollars in global circulation, if you look at the amount of money that's been printed by the Fed, that's been monetized, government spending that's just been printed out of thin air over the past year or two, if you take that amount of money and you look at it compared to all dollars in circulation across the entire world, it might not be a very big number. But if you look at it in terms of the amount of dollars circulating in the United States that are being used in the U.S. economy, in consumer spending, I think that this amount of spending would be significant in terms of that, if that makes sense. Because you can't just think of all dollars in aggregate across the entire planet. Because when you're talking about, what we colloquially call inflation, the official government metrics are looking at consumer prices. So you're really looking at consumption, at the consumer economy. So if you have to say to yourself, is all of this government spending, which is being made possible through debt monetization, through the Fed printing money and giving it to the federal government essentially in a roundabout way, is this significantly boosting consumption over what it otherwise would be? And at this point, I think we can safely say the answer is yes. Now, to some of you, that might sound, well, duh, obviously, inflation is going up. But it's when you just see inflation is not necessarily inflation, to start off with. What the government calls inflation is rising prices. You can have what really is more useful to refer to inflation as is growth in the money supply. What might be called monetary inflation. That's how I and a lot of other people try and reserve the word inflation, because prices can go up for other reasons that aren't related to the monetary system. And also at the same time, you could have monetary inflation, what I would just call inflation, without an actual rise in consumer prices. So these are separate issues. And so what I'm getting at here is that if this rise in prices, the only way that the Fed hiking rates and tapering their asset purchases, the only way that is going to temper price inflation is if those prices are going up because of money production, because of money printing. And so that's why I look at this are the price increases that we're seeing now the result of an increase in the supply of money in the consumer economy? Again, at this point, I think I'm going to say yes, because we have to look at, there's a tough thing, in economics, there's a limitless number of variables, so it's very hard to isolate anything. And so that's why it's much more of an art than a science. But if I'm looking at what variables have changed and what variables have stayed the same, what's changed? I think there are two big macroeconomic shifts that have occurred since the onset of the initial crisis. And that is a massive surge in government deficit spending, which has been monetized by the Fed, and two, a big drop-off in production. Less people are working, less stuff is being produced, less stuff is, it's hard to say whether less stuff on aggregate is being imported. I don't think that's actually the case. I think a lot more stuff is being imported. And that's, partially to make up for the drop in domestic production, which is partially leading to these supply chain bottlenecks, because we're having to import even more than before. And so when you look at all this and you see what they call inflation on TV, rising prices, it is a result both, I think, of the increase in money being injected into the consumer economy through, government spending, deficit spending, and it's also a result of production dropping off. So this is a case of increasing demand and decreasing supply. And so how do you reverse that? How do you end these price increases as a result of those two things? Well, when it comes to money printing, the way that you stop monetary inflation is by ceasing money production or even decreasing the money supply. So that's what it is. You have to control the money supply. You need to stop injecting so much money in. Is the federal government going to stop with its massive stimulus bills? There's some, what's the term? Gridlock. I kept thinking gridiron. I'm like, no, this is not football. A gridlock in Congress right now that's preventing that. But it seems we're getting a steady dose of $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there for over a year now. And so I don't expect that to just go away necessarily. Now the other thing, the supply side issues, what people like to keep calling the supply chain bottlenecks, all these sorts of things. Do I see production returning to not just not just 2019 levels, because population is increasing. Things should be going up. It needs to grow much more than back to 2019 levels. Production in the aggregate needs to grow quite a bit to satisfy all of this demand, to sop up all of these dollars, because it's a classic case of a little too much money chasing a little too few goods. And so what this comes down to me, or I shouldn't say that, it's not everything, but the common through line that goes through every industry is fuel and energy. You need energy in order for the economy to operate. You need energy in order to produce things. There's no way around that. And so as energy prices continue to rise, which this energy prices rising is not like inflation. People say, oh yeah, we have inflation. Gas is $3.50 a gallon, or $4 a gallon, or $5 a gallon. That's not really inflation, because fuel prices fluctuate. But if we're going into an era now where all of these countries around the world want to be green and make fossil fuels expensive, energy is going to be relatively scarce. And if the scarcer energy is, the less gets produced. That's just, you have to ration scarce resources like energy. And when you have less energy, you can produce less things. As countries like the United States get so-called greener, which they're not really greener because you have to produce these batteries, which have a whole hell of a lot of waste and are themselves not a fossil fuel, but there's a scarce amount of lithium on the planet. And it's just a fact that oil and coal and natural gas are much more economically efficient than any of the so-called green energy solutions. And if the green energy, if we could produce just as much energy for the same cost through any of these green energy things, we would already be using more of them. We would already be producing more, solar power or wind power or whatever, or hydroelectric power. If you forcibly shift the economy away from fossil fuels, by definition, you're going to be producing less energy. And so goods, which require energy to be produced, in the aggregate, will become more and more scarce. And so prices necessarily will have to continue to rise. Now, that's not inflation. That's different. And what I mean by that is, even if the Fed hikes interest rates, it doesn't necessarily mean the prices are going to come down. If prices are rising because of just pure scarcity, because there's not that many goods to go around, because we can't produce enough goods. Even if you slowed the rate of growth of the money supply, which is the best you can ask for from these central banks, you'll never reduce the money supply, certainly. That's not going to happen. Prices are even if the demand, if the inflationary problem on the demand side is reined in, the supply side is going to continue pushing prices higher and higher. And so the moral of the story here is that even if the Fed wanted to rein in inflation, which they don't, because Jerome Powell, I think, wants to keep his job. He's not going to keep his job in all likelihood, but he wants to keep his job. And so that means that he can't do anything to piss off the administration. He can't tighten. And Jerome Powell's been an ultra-dove for his entire tenure as Fed chairman already. So why would he, at the end, come in and turn the music off and ruin the party? Powell doesn't want to be the guy who takes away the punch bowl. He's going to want to kick that can down the road for as long as he can. And so he's not going to raise interest rates. But even if he did, I'm not totally confident. I mean, unless he really raised them. But he's not going to do that. I don't think that prices would stop going up, even if you stopped inflating the money supply. And that's what I mean when I say this is not just inflation. It's not the rising prices are not just a problem of inflation. In order to really get things back on track to where we have increasing prosperity, where things are getting cheaper, when people are getting wealthier on the whole. Because when goods get cheaper, everyone gets richer. Because someone, making the same income, if everything gets cheaper by 5% or 2% a year, if cost of living goes down and you're making the same amount of money, you just got richer. If we have negative 2% inflation and your wages stagnate, that's equivalent to a 2% raise. And so that's why, price deflation is good. That's why a stagnant money supply, a really neutral money supply, is so good, because it allows people to take advantage of the fruits of increased production efficiencies. But when the world is trying to go green and production is getting less efficient, even if the money supply was not driving prices higher, the reduction in the supply of goods, which is, a foregone conclusion when you're trying to forcibly go green, that's going to continue to push prices higher. And so I'm not entirely sure. I think right now maybe going green is not the biggest part, not the biggest issue. But if we continue down this road, California trying to get rid of gasoline engines, which is going to spread everywhere else. Europe getting rid of gasoline engines. People are thinking, oh, well, maybe this will make gas cheaper because there will be less demand for gas. Well, what good is that if the only reason why gas is going down is because nobody's allowed to use it? Whatever other energy we're forced to use is going to become more expensive. Energy is the most important resource in any, post-caveman economy. And so if you want the kind of prosperity that people are used to, you need cheap energy. You need to pretty much eliminate carbon emission standards. You need to quit worrying about carbon, because carbon is not an issue. Dirty air is an issue, sure. Smog used to be an issue. It's not an issue anymore because engines these days are very efficient. Smog is the result of unburnt fuel. For those of you who don't aware, that's what makes things smoke. When you see colored smoke coming out of an internal combustion engine, whether it's diesel or gas or whatever, that's unburnt fuel. And unburnt fuel is also, you're wasting energy, because that's energy that could have been gone into the explosion in the, internal combustion part. That's where the name comes from. And so the market was incentivized to make engines that are more and more efficient, that use fuel more and more efficiently. Now, unfortunately, because of the way that, we have all this pollution control crap, even though engines are more efficient, you don't necessarily take advantage of that in terms of better fuel economy all the time. Like diesel engines, fuel economy over the last 20 years has gotten worse and worse if you drive something with a diesel engine, because they're choking on emissions, even though the engines themselves are, way more efficient than they were 20 years ago. Across the world, we have this artificial definition of efficiency when it comes to internal combustion engines and energy production in general. Whereas the only efficiency that we really should worry about is economic efficiency. And by that, I don't mean that we should pollute the air. I just mean that as for an engine to become more economically efficient, it is going to pollute the air less. Unless, of course, you consider CO2 to be a pollutant, which is preposterous. Because in that case, you need to start murdering the human race, because human beings emit CO2. And so you can see how quickly the anti-carbon dioxide jihad turns into an anti-humanity jihad. And it's pretty thinly veiled. Most people who are into this will tell you that they generally speaking think that humans are a virus. And that back when they believed in global warming, they thought it was, the Earth getting a fever to try and, kill the virus being us, humanity. So this is a multi-step plan. If you want to really deal with the problem of rising prices in an economy, it's bigger than just the issue of monetary inflation. It's not just the Fed anymore, sadly. You need to deal with the Fed. You need to rein them in. You need to stop increasing the money supply. Ideally, the money supply will be totally fixed a set number of dollars in circulation. I can explain that in more detail if people are interested, why I say it has to be an exact number. But it has to do with the business cycle and distorting economic incentives. But I won't get into that here. And then, second of all, you need to stop with the fake, going green crusade. All of this stuff about going green isn't even going to be better for the environment. It just seems to be a grift every time I look into it. I haven't found any real, genuine research behind it. In order to make all of this green technology, like solar panels and lithium batteries, you gotta do a number on the planet in order to produce these things. And then when these batteries are spent, they you end up having to pollute the earth when you throw them away. Oh, and by the way, they spontaneously combust, as we have seen with Teslas, which just, they get into a wreck and then they burst into flames. And fire departments don't know how to put them out. Now, I'm sure that kind of thing they could, I'm sure that in time they will refine that and these batteries will become less volatile. But my point is, this, the net zero carbon emissions thing is a totally arbitrary goal. Okay, sure, you're eliminating carbon, which is not bad for the planet, and you're replacing it with a bunch of this other stuff that is bad for the planet. And you're making everyone on the planet poorer on top of it. So not a good trade-off. And unfortunately, there's no one, especially, this is the one aspect of, I guess you could say, like political correctness or wokeness that people on the right really haven't figured out how to attack. And I think it's because it's just so complicated that people don't even want to put in the time to try and do enough research to argue against it. But it's not that hard. Embrace carbon. It's a very important part. It's it's a building block of life. And so people need to attack this idea that carbon is evil. And we need to go back to using fossil fuels openly. There's no capex right now going into fossil fuels. Energy production is going to fall because there's no money being invested into fossil fuels. And we need them in order to maintain our current standard of living. If fossil fuels were becoming more scarce, if we were reaching peak oil and we couldn't find enough of it, we couldn't find enough coal to burn and all this stuff, at that point, you would start to see gradually investment shift into alternative forms of energy and ways to hopefully try and invest in it to make it cheaper. But they're not able to do that right now. It's not getting cheaper. Or it is, but it's just, it's nowhere near cheap enough to compete with fossil fuels. And remember, prices of comparable goods, prices of goods which are sort of substitutes for one another, they are indicators of relative scarcity. So if electricity generated by wind turbines costs twice as much as electricity generated by coal-fired power plants, well, what that indicates is that if you were to shift the energy, your energy production completely from 100% from coal over to 100% wind, you would only be generating about half as much electricity. That's as much as you're going to get. Because if the price is double, your resources that you have to allocate on energy, they're not going up. You're not getting richer to compensate for the increase in the price of energy. You're going to get poorer relatively, because your same amount of money is only going to buy you half as much energy. And so the places on Earth that don't go along with this, that embrace fossil fuels and say, you know what, we do like our power to be cheap, we want more electricity, we think that we can increase our standard of living by having more electricity and by having gas-powered cars that we can drive hundreds of miles, and which we can just fill up with more gas and not have to wait for a battery to charge and whatnot. Those will be the places that will be able to increase or maintain their standards of living. But all the other places, like the way the United States is going right now, just look at California over the past 20 years. That place is not getting richer. They're getting poorer. And that's going to happen here in the rest of the United States. I think we're at the start of it. And unfortunately, I don't see any end in sight, unless things change. The Fed has to change its behavior, yes, but so does the regime. The green agenda must be emphatically denounced. And that's just about all I have to say about that.